Hello and welcome to this environmental studies revision video on cycles of matter. And this is a particularly important area. Cycles of matter, whether they're being water, carbon or nitrogen, are all examples of closed systems, and we'll be looking particularly today at carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle. So you need to be able to talk your way through the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is a flow of carbon between biotic and abiotic factors. So the best place for you to start with this at all times is in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, obviously as CO2, and that comes out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So plants are called photoautotrophs because they're using the light of the energy from the sun to capture that carbon dioxide and turn it into organic glucose. So plants fix carbon dioxide into glucose in photosynthesis. So then what happens? Well, then the animals may eat the plants, so primary consumers eat the plants, okay, and obviously that carbon goes into the animal, and that can also go into the future animals along the path. Now, all living things, whether it be a plant or whether it be an animal or even bacteria, have to respire even. So they respire, they do have to reproduce, but they also have to respire. So they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through respiration. Now, when living things, whether it be a tree or animals, die, they break down and get broken down by decomposers, and they become what we call detritus, okay, and they break down and are decomposed. When the bacteria, I don't want you to use this word, I want you to use decomposers. When the bacteria decompose dead living things, they return the carbon dioxide also to the atmosphere via respiration. And if they fail to decompose due to the conditions that they're in, maybe it's in anaerobic conditions, slowly dead living things will turn into fossils. And obviously for a long, long time, this balance of carbon in our atmosphere and in the solid part of our world between the biotic and abiotic components was balanced. But now, because of human activity, our combustion of fossil fuels has meant that a huge amount of carbon dioxide is being returned to the atmosphere and unbalancing that cycle. So some of the key words you need to know, which I mentioned: carbon fixation is when carbon from carbon dioxide is locked into solid components, i.e. into glucose. So you need to know that carbon sinks are things that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it, and this becomes part of the organism's biomass, or it could become part of fossil fuels. Inorganic examples also exist, and carbon dioxide can be turned into calcium carbonate, and this happens in the oceans where carbon dioxide might be absorbed by the oceans itself, and seashells and marine organisms absorb that carbon dioxide, turn it into shells, and then as they die over thousands of years, they become sedimentary rocks. Soil also can hold some carbon dioxide, and obviously carbon dioxide is also found in the atmosphere. So there is something called the carbon budget, and you can see here you might be asked to calculate how much carbon dioxide is either being emitted or absorbed into the area based on the different things. But the key thing is to remember carbon dioxide can come out of the atmosphere due to photosynthesis. It can be absorbed by photosynthetic algae in the sea and plankton, and the oceans can absorb carbon as well, but the other factors are releasing it. So at the minute there is a higher amount as a net release of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere because of this area here of fossil fuel combustion and deforestation and fires. So we need to understand this carbon budget and human activity. So the diagram here puts some numbers onto the carbon budget. And this carbon budget shows you quite nicely the impacts of human activity. So you can see here that surface phytoplankton absorbs about 100 of carbon dioxide, and it releases about 100, slightly more absorbed than released. And you can see here that biomass on the land absorbs 100 and releases slightly more than 100 as well. And why is that the case? Well, if you look at the numbers, 5.5, so this shows us why carbon dioxide is increasing. We're adding 5.5, in this case, gigatons of carbon dioxide a year via fossil fuels being burned, but also deforestation is what is causing this number to be above 100, and it adds about 1.6 into the atmosphere. And in terms of fixation, what we can say is that phytoplankton takes 2.4 out, and new forest growth only takes 0.5 out. So what is happening is there is a balance here that is unbalanced. More is going into the atmosphere than is being absorbed overall. And human activity has now added over 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And we'll look at this in a different module in much more detail, is the effect of carbon emissions on the ocean. So the ocean is a massive carbon sink. It absorbs up to 25% of our current carbon dioxide emissions, but carbon dissolves in the oceans to make carbonic acid. So when it reacts with water, it makes something called carbonic acid, and that is slowly lowering the pH of the oceans. Now, this is causing big problems because it is causing increased algal growth in some places, which is causing eutrophication, but it's also causing some algae in the coral reefs to become calcified, and that is causing a lack of coral reefs, so it's causing coral bleaching, and it's also affecting any animals that have shells, because the acid causes the shells to dissolve in the water. But the main area we'll look at in the future is coral reef acidification and therefore coral reef bleaching. This ESS revision video for topic 7.3, climate change, and looking at mitigation of climate change and adaptation to the effects of climate. So we need to understand that governments are only really starting to face the idea of climate change. It's estimated that if we wanted to completely tackle it, it would cost 2% of the world's global GDP to tackle it. That probably doesn't seem like a lot, and actually, realistically, it would be worth doing, but it's not likely to happen. Currently, fossil fuel usage is still increasing, and the politics is really difficult to plan because you're looking at 100 years into the future when governments generally are every 4 to 5 years elected, so they're always trying to look at short-term benefits. There are 3 routes for climate change and how we should tackle it. We could either do nothing, which is obviously not a good idea probably, wait and see but respond as changes happen, or we could take precautions, which is the focus of this. So the first thing we're going to look at is mitigation strategies. Now this is an important word because they will use this word in the exam and ask you to identify different mitigation strategies and evaluate them. So a mitigation strategy means to mitigate against or reduce the emissions of climate change. And basically there are 3 sort of ways we can do this. We can stabilise or reduce the greenhouse emissions, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or use geoengineering. So what we want to do is we want to look at then mitigation, and that is the idea of using technology, so it's technocentrics, reduce emissions, or enhance our carbon sinks. So let's have a look at how we can do that. So the following ways then can be sorted into anthropocentric, technocentric, or ecocentricism. So the first thing is we can reduce waste by making more efficient engines and insulate buildings. So we can reduce the carbon dioxide produced from these. We can reduce electricity by turning lights off when watching television less, for example. We can walk and use more public transport. We can do taxes on carbon. We can do national limits on greenhouse emissions. We can use green air zones. We can capture methane from landfills and use it. We can invest in sustainable agriculture. We can ban diesel cars from producing emissions. So if you think about this, which ones of these are anthropocentric? Well, I would say anthropocentric would be your taxes and limits, okay, and maybe green air zones, okay. Which ones are technocentrics? Efficient engines are obviously going to be technocentrics. Reducing electricity usage is actually probably going to be ecocentric, and a bit anthrocentric. So I think that one is sort of 2 really. Okay. Walk more, well, that's going to be anthrocentric, I'd say, changing people's behaviours. Capture more methane from landfills, that's going to be technocentric. Invest more in sustainable agriculture, yeah. And then ban diesel cars, that's going to be more of this anthropocentric approach. So what adaptation strategies can we use? Well, what we can do is we can reduce adverse effects by maximising the benefits of climate change. So we want to do both things. We want to reduce the effect and maximise it. So we can look at this, but there is a problem with this capacity. How much can we do this? Like in COP27 recently, who pays and how much for? So we can change on planning legislation. So for example, saying there's no houses on potential floodplains, so that will stop impacts there. We could build to future flooding, so think about how we can catch that water and raise houses to cope with it. We can change our agriculture to cope with the changes. We can manage weather with tree planting, such as more acid rain. We can manage weather using tree planting, so to capture and absorb more rain, and we can obviously migrate to new areas. We can vaccinate against spreading diseases, and we can do water management issues as well. However, none of these things are actually dealing with the problems, which means we'd keep having to add extra layers. Now, some adaptation strategies have been seen in London. So you can see now that we've got buildings that have plants on them, which obviously will do more photosynthesis, but the main reason is they insulate the buildings really well, and they stop the buildings absorbing as much heat in the summer. We've got rainwater harvesting systems, reducing the pressure on the water supply, and buildings can be cooled without increasing energy demand as a result, because you can use that as a coolant. White roofs, more white roofs the better, because it reflects the heat. Solar panels to increase energy efficiency. Blinds to keep homes cool in the summer. Tree tops to avoid shading. Okay, and lots of methods in there. So obviously you've also talked about COP, and COP26 was the one that was ordained before this video. And this is the idea of increasing ambitions against climate change, reducing emissions, and increasing finance for those countries to keep the temperature down and make adaptations as much as possible. The COP26 summit came out with the idea that we need to phase down uses of coal, stop deforestation by 2030, which has had a big push since the new president in Brazil has agreed to that. Cutting methane emissions by 30% and submit new action plans to the UN to keep battling climate change. Since 27, and some people feel this wasn't as successful. There was an agreement which was important, a loss and damage fund to be given to countries that are experiencing the most damage due to climate, and the ones that are least able to afford it. There are issues as to where that money is going to come from, but most people would say most of the failures come from the idea that there's no forward pushing of fossil fuels. There's still too much fossil fuel being used, and we're not likely to hit our 1.5 degree target.